For centuries, people have been fascinated by the idea of prolonging their youth. In recent years, scientists have begun to make progress in the quest to extend human life. But in this week's New Yorker magazine, Malcolm Gladwell questions, will we be living longer or dying longer? I am pleased to have him here join us for a conversation about what he has written about. Here is his story right here. A reporter at large, the new age of man. Scientists were once content just to get rid of fatal diseases. Now some of them are actually trying to extend the human life cycle. But will we be living longer or dying longer? How did this story come about? First of all, welcome back to the broadcast.
Thank you. Thank you.
You've changed your position. Last time you were sitting over here.
Yeah. Well, there was a lot of interest at the magazine because this is a topic that has suddenly become really hot. I mean, if you've noticed in the media, a lot of magazines have been devoting a lot of attention to aging issues and the new science of aging. But most of them, our feeling was, have been talking about aging in a real kind of naive and credulous way.
Yeah.
And I think what we wanted to do was to try and look a little harder and a little more skeptical at what exactly is happening.
And how did you go about that?
Well, I was, first of all, I was I thought from reading other people, particularly all these stories about melatonin and the books on the bestseller list about these miracle hormones, that sort of naturally provoked a little bit of skepticism in my mind because it sounds too good to be true. When people talk about DHEA or testosterone, Newsweek just had a big cover story.
I know. Well, we did the story.
Yeah. And that's just, I mean, the skeptic in me says it's not that easy. And if it was that easy, then you know, we would have all done this 20, 30 years ago. But the other question is that if you come at it not from the science perspective, from the economics, but from the economics perspective, which a lot of people are doing now, which is the really interesting side of this, you begin to see how hard these questions are. Like, it's the economists, for example, who for the past 10 years have been saying, look, if we extend life, there are a variety of different scenarios here, and each of these scenarios has profound consequences. And they're the ones who said, look, if we extend life, and what we do by extending life is simply extend the period that people are sick. So if instead of dying at 85, you die at 90, but instead of being sick for the last year of your life, that means that you're now going to be sick for the last 6 years of your life, the last 5 years of your life. In other words, if all those extra years are sick years, the implications of that for society are really huge. You know, right now, Social Security and Medicare are going bankrupt. But if we make scientific changes that have the effect, or medical changes that have the effect of extending the period of disability in old age, how are we going to pay for that? And I think that was such a, when I sort of ran across this argument, which is raging right now among economists, I thought, well, this is the really interesting question to ask about all this aging stuff that's not being asked by the people writing these credulous articles and books about DHEA and melatonin, which is, you know, what exactly happens when you extend life?
You're asking, can we afford?
That's one of the questions I think we've got to ask.
Not just financially, but in terms of its financial and cultural impact.
Yeah, exactly. That, I mean, there are different, I guess the idea that motivated this was, look, aging can mean a number of different things, and we have to be precise, and we have to figure out what it's meaning. I mean, what direction aging is going to take.
But can you ever stop something like that?
You can't, but what you can do is, by asking the right questions and by figuring out where you're going, you can make adjustments. For example,
You can direct.
For example, in the piece, I talk a lot about what it would mean to wipe out cancer. And I have that whole section where I say, wiping out cancer actually, which is a wonderful thing to do, and no one ever said we shouldn't do it. But if you think about wiping out cancer as it's not an answer to the aging problem, because old people who die of cancer are, as all these economists and epidemiologists have demonstrated, many of them are already sick with a number of other diseases. So if you take away cancer, it means they die of something else. They don't actually live that much longer, but they end up being sicker for longer at the end of their life. Now that is something that, if we're going to wipe out cancer, then it means we're going to have to address the other problems of aging at the same time, if we're actually going to cure the aging problem. You've got to address arthritis, or you've got to address Alzheimer's. Otherwise, what's the point in extending someone's life by 5 years if it just means they spend 5 years with Alzheimer's in a nursing home, 5 more years with Alzheimer's in a nursing home? You've got to do these things in tandem. That's what I mean by asking the right questions. You can say, look, let's devote as many resources to addressing the problems of disability in old age as we do to addressing the problems of fatal diseases in old age.
When you think about these things, I'm going over to the side of sort of being in awe of the whole process. How far away are we, you know?
That's a really good question. And no one really knows. But we can say this, that we're an awful lot closer than we were 5 years ago. I mean, if we had this conversation 5 years ago, we would be talking entirely speculatively. And it would almost be like we were just having a discussion about science fiction. In the last 5 years, there has been an extraordinary movement on a number of different levels in understanding the aging problem. Just to give an example, the way you work when you're thinking about trying to extend the life of organisms, you start with lower organisms. You start with worms, or you start with mice, or you start with fruit flies. And in the last 5 years, people have done some really dramatic things in lower organisms, and those are lessons that you can apply to human beings. I went out to California and saw, it's in a lab of a woman named Cynthia Kenyon at UCSF, and she's taken nematodes, little microscopic worms, beautiful, C. elegans, beautiful. You see them under the microscope. They normally live 2 weeks. She's got them living a month and a half. And that's extraordinary. You can look through the microscope and you see these worms. They are living 3 times longer than a normal worm. And they look, I mean, they're sort of wiggling along under the microscope. And it makes you realize, wow, you know, this is a fundamental manipulation. How
far is it to extend the life of a worm and extend the life of a human being?
It's a long way, but it's not. But there are. I mean, all of the things that we know about human genetics pretty much come from fruit flies and worms.
Right.
So I mean, this is a model that we've worked with before. And you work up the scale. You do worms, then you do flies, then you do mice. And when you start with mice, I mean, we use mice as models in a whole variety of medical research for cancer,
for testing and everything else.
Testing everything. I mean, you're getting to, and there are people. There's a guy in Canada right now who has dramatically extended the lifespan of mice. I mean, so we've got mice now that we're manipulating to live longer. So I mean, it's not, you know, we're getting into the ballpark here where we can start thinking about what we can do with human beings.
It's hard for me to imagine people. I mean, the difficulty in talking about this is that, of course, if your life is going to be horrible, you know, there are too many people who've been sick who, you know, if you see it up close, that they're better off if they don't live too long the way they're living. I mean, it has to have its own time and place. You know, and you don't want to sort of see it end the first day. At the same time, you don't want to see it go on for 1,000 days. Yet at the same time, there is something magical about. I mean, as one human being without disease, as far as I know, love life. You know, and the idea that at 54. This could be extended is just a wonderful notion to me. I mean, you may be too young to even appreciate that.
Well,
you know.
No, I can see the lure, and what is driving a lot of this interest is the fact that we have an extremely large, the biggest bulge of the American population is now in their 40s and 50s.
Middle class, right? I mean, middle age.
Middle age, and suddenly these issues have a kind of urgency that they haven't had in a long time. And I think as well that that we're beginning to see what happened. The difference between what's going on now and what was going on 20 years ago is that 20 years ago people saw death and old age as inevitable, and they saw it as something that we were just programmed to fall apart at a certain age. Now when you talk to these scientists, they don't think that anymore. They talk about old age and growing old as like a chronic disease, something that's manageable, and that change in the language of discussing old age and mortality has had a profound effect on our expectations. Now we expect science to be able to do something, and that's really, I think, a huge difference in the conceptualization of old age.
My sense is about these kinds of things, it is that we don't know where it'll go, you know, and while the experiment in extending life takes place with worms and flies and onto rats and whatever, that as we find ways to extend life, we'll also find ways to rid ourselves of great diseases, whether it's heart disease or cancer, AIDS. But at the same time, around the corner is some new disease we know nothing about. That's the process.
That's a very interesting point, because a number of people that I talked to, gerontologists, have said, you know, if all of a sudden, if the population, which now life expectancy is, 78 or 79, if we extended that 15 years, if all of a sudden everybody's living an extra 10 years at the end of their life, what we're going to see is a whole bunch of diseases that we don't think of now as fatal will become fatal. I mean, all of a sudden, things like, if you think of arthritis or diabetes or diseases that, sort of chronic diseases of old age that are manageable now, maybe if everyone was living an extra 10 years tacked on at the end of their life, suddenly these diseases would assume, and we were solving diseases that kill us now early, or heart disease and cancer, maybe all of a sudden these things that haven't seemed like problems before would all of a sudden come to the fore and be seen as the real, killers and the real problems that affect. That's why it's a really tricky process when you start playing with all of the kind of the variables that affect people in old age.
But the magic of the fountain of youth is extraordinary as an elixir. Michael Rose, what did you learn from?
Well, Michael Rose is this really interesting man. I mean, an absolutely brilliant man. Somewhat controversial within his field because, like all of these brilliant scientists, he is a driven, arrogant, he thinks he is absolutely right and everyone who disagrees with him is wrong. I mean, he is what you expect from one of these high-powered scientist types. He's a fruit fly guy, and he has got these fruit flies, which he's basically doubled in their lifespan. And not only has he doubled their lifespan, but he has basically taken the normal sort of sickly fruit fly, and he's made it into a kind of an uber fly. I mean, these flies, they'll stay. They can withstand starvation far longer. They can stay afloat far longer. They live longer lives. I mean, these are really, you go into his lab.
These super flies.
Yeah, he's got super flies. He's got this huge lab full of these flies that basically, I mean, they are just outperforming the normal fruit flies by these extraordinary. And he's seen what he can do with flies, and he is absolutely convinced that he can apply these same lessons to human beings.
Over what period of time?
Tough question. What he wants to do right now is he wants to repeat his fly. He has a particular way of extending fruit fly lives. Basically what he does is he breeds for longevity. Right now, when fruit flies mate, the ones that can reproduce the fastest, the most sexually precocious fruit flies are the ones that pass on their genes, because they're the ones who they produce offspring first, their offspring crowd out everybody else's, and so you have this cycle where all the genes that get passed on are the precocious genes. Well, what he does is he takes his fruit flies and he kills all the offspring that are born early, and he only breeds the offspring that are born at the very end of the fruit fly life cycle. So essentially what he's doing is, for the first time in evolutionary history, he is passing on the genes that correspond not to sexual precocity, but rather to longevity, to being able to be fertile latest. And he's done this for 10 years, and he's got these flies, which are bred specifically for longevity. Now, obviously, you don't do that with human beings because it would take hundreds and hundreds of years, and you couldn't do that. But what you can do is you can look at the animals that have longevity, and you can learn what they're doing differently and apply that to humans. And that's what he wants to do.
My last question is, what can I take now?
If I were you, I would take nothing now because it's way, way too early, and don't go taking melatonin or DHEA. But I would wait. I mean, amazing things are going to happen in the next 10 years.
This article by Malcolm is in this issue, the September 30th issue of the New Yorker magazine, provocative ideas about the future with, in some cases, alarming consequences. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Provocative ideas about extending life and some of the problems might occur if, in fact, it happens. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time.